Good morning. Uh, for some reason, I always get put in churches to read for Mrs. Fletcher, and it means I get to introduce some words that aren't often spoken in churches. So, what I'll do is I'm going to read you a short section from Mrs. Fletcher, and then I just hope we can have a conversation. If you don't have questions, then I'll filibuster, but I would much rather just answer your questions and have a conversation. Mrs. Fletcher, well, let me just start by saying I'm a fiction writer, and I'm not an especially autobiographical one. Earlier in my career, I was. I wrote 3 books that kind of followed my life. They're set in New Jersey in a kind of the working class part of that state that I grew up in. That's Bad Haircut, which is really a coming of age collection of stories about a kid who's something like me. Then there was the Wishbones, which wasn't about me, but was about guys I grew up with who played in rock bands and ended up playing in a wedding band. And then Joe College's very autobiographical book about a kid who grows up in a place similar to the place I grew up in and goes to Yale and has a kind of culture shock in, moving from one social world to another. And after that, I felt like I kind of burned through my life as material for novels. And what happened, this is around the time of the book Little Children, and I started writing a lot more about female protagonists and writing about sort of what was happening in the world at that time. But those books were also kind of following the arc of my life as mainly as a parent, so Little Children is a book about parents of young children, and The Abstinence Teacher is that sort of time when your kids are in like middle school and their lives sort of revolve around youth sports. And The Leftovers is a little bit of an aberration, but even there, the kids are sort of high school and college age. And then Mrs. Fletcher is really like an empty nest novel. So that chapter 1 begins, Eve Fletcher is a 46-year-old divorced woman with 1 child, and she drops him off at college. And she comes home to a very empty nest and tries to figure out what is her life going to be at this point. And one of the real issues for her is she's alone, she's 46, she is sort of feeling like maybe her sexual and romantic life is not just on hiatus, but maybe she's done with that. And what happens is she gets a text, an anonymous, obscene text that calls her a MILF. And she kind of knows what that is. For those of you who don't, it's an acronym that you shouldn't Google. And it's one of the, if you're under 40, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're older, you may or may not. But she does Google it because she just wants to make sure, is she being insulted or being flattered? It's kind of a combination of both. But she discovers this world of porn. It's sort of amateur porn. I'll talk a little bit about it in what I read. But it kind of fills this empty space in her life, and she finds herself going back to it, somewhat obsessively, even though she doesn't necessarily approve of it. It does something to her. And the chapter I'm going to read is sort of about what happens to Eve when she kind of allows this porn to kind of infiltrate her sexual imagination. And the chapter is called The Confident One. Eve works as the executive director of a senior center in a town maybe about 40 minutes outside of Boston. When Eve invited Amanda out for a drink, she hadn't meant it to be a date. It was a casual social thing, two colleagues hanging out after work, getting to know each other a little better. And it wasn't even Eve's idea. All she'd done was belatedly accept an invitation that Amanda had extended more than once, and that she herself had felt guilty about declining. There was no hidden agenda. She was just being polite, making amends, and giving them both something to do on an otherwise empty Friday night. And yet, it felt like a date, which was weird because Eve didn't date women. Of course, she wasn't dating any men either, though that was only for lack of opportunity. If a man had asked her out, she would have happily said yes, unless it was Creepy Barry from Gender and Society. Eve has, one of the things she's done to sort of fill up her life is she's gone to community college and she's taking a class in Gender and Society. So anyway, unless it was Creepy Barry from Gender and Society, who unfortunately was the only man expressing any interest at the moment. But if tonight wasn't a date, and it definitely wasn't, then what accounted for the fluttery feeling of anticipation she'd been experiencing ever since she'd marked it on her calendar? And why had she chosen to wear this silky green blouse that went so well with her eyes, and then unbuttoned it one button lower than usual? The answer to these questions, Eve knew, was as simple as it was embarrassing. She'd been watching too much porn, and it had infected her imagination, making her hyper-aware of the sexual possibilities embedded in the most innocent situations. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so pathetic. In the lesbian MILF videos Eve liked best, there was only one basic scenario. A confident woman seduces a reluctant one. Many began with the reluctant woman grumpily washing dishes or mopping the floor when the doorbell rings. The visitor, the confident one, usually arrives with a bottle of wine, a sympathetic expression, and a bit of exposed cleavage. Cut to the two women on the couch, deep in conversation, usually sitting close together. Often their knees are touching. "It is so good to see you," the confident one says, stroking her friend's thigh or upper arm in a comforting and arguably non-sexual way. "But you look a little sad." The reluctant one doesn't deny it. "It's been a rough day," she sighs. Maybe she lost her job. Maybe her husband left her. Maybe the bank turned down her loan application. But whatever the problem might be, it's nothing that can't be solved by a back rub and some cunnilingus. In the videos Eve liked best, the women were friends or neighbors or former romantic partners. Some of the other scenarios were a little more problematic, playing on age and power differentials that would have raised serious red flags in real life. A teacher doesn't think a pupil's been working up to her potential. A homesick foreign exchange student needs a little cheering up. A cougarish stepmother puts the moves on her sullen but very persuadable stepdaughter. In the porn world, no one seemed to have heard of sexual harassment. Doctors went down on their patients. Personal trainers fondled their clients. Underperforming employees found creative ways to save their jobs. Eve would have objected strenuously to these scenarios if a man had been involved. But with two women, it was different somehow, a little more playful and not nearly as creepy. Just a harmless fantasy, rather than something that reminded you of an infuriating article you'd read in the paper or a bad experience recounted by a friend. "There was a girl in my dorm who transitioned," Amanda said. "It was an amazing thing to watch. When she showed up freshman year, she was so plain and quiet, nobody even noticed her. Then she cut her hair and started dressing like a boy. Sophomore year, she began the hormone therapy. Junior year, her voice got deep, and it was like, I'm not Linda anymore. Please call me Lowell. That summer, Lowell got the top surgery. By the end of senior year, he was this buff, handsome dude with a scruffy beard and a motorcycle. Lots of girls I knew dated him. It got to be sort of a thing, you know? Like, cross that one off the bucket list. Eve nodded, but the story sounded so foreign to her. When she'd been in college, there was a woman on campus with patches of dark hair on her face, but nobody thought she was cool or intriguing. People mostly just felt sorry for the poor girl and did their best not to stare. Eve assumed she was suffering from a medical condition or some kind of cosmic misfortune. It had never even occurred to her that the bearded woman might be making a choice, moving in the direction of happiness. So these girls who dated Lowell, Eve said, were they straight or bi or what? All kinds. Amanda lowered her gaze, adjusting the napkin in her lap. I asked him out for coffee one afternoon. We had a pretty good time. When it was over, he drove me home on his motorcycle, and we made out a little outside my apartment. It got pretty heavy, but when he asked if we could go up to my room, I chickened out. I guess I wasn't ready for whatever that was going to be, which is saying something, because I was pretty much up for anything back then. But he was totally cool about it. The next time I saw him, he was dating this beautiful Turkish girl from my Milton class. That's so amazing, Eve said. It's like a modern-day Cinderella story. You change your body and your name, and all your dreams come true. I wish I could do that myself. Really? Not the man part. Just the chance to leave your old self behind, to take all your mistakes and regrets and erase them from the story. Who wouldn't want that? Amanda nodded, as if that made a lot of sense. So who would you be if you could start over? I don't know. I haven't given it a lot of thought. What about your name? What would you call yourself? Let's see. Eve closed her eyes, and a name appeared to her, unbidden. Blue letters stamped on a gift shop license plate. Ursula. I'd call myself Ursula. That's a strong name. What's this Ursula like? Braver than me, Eve said. She does what she wants. Doesn't worry so much about what everybody else thinks. Doesn't settle for less than she deserves or apologize unless it's absolutely necessary. She just wants to live and have adventures. Amanda smiled. I like this person. Eve knew she'd said more than enough, but she was on a roll. Ursula probably doesn't work at the senior center. I'm sorry to hear that, Amanda said, but she didn't sound sorry. She does something a little more exciting, Eve said. Maybe she's a travel writer. She wears sunglasses and has lots of affairs. She sounds pretty sexy. Eve scratched at a yellowish stain on the coffee table, hoping her face wasn't as pink as it felt. She was a little drunk, a little embarrassed, and strangely exhilarated. What about you, she said. Who would you be? Juniper, Amanda spoke without hesitation. I'd be petite and graceful, maybe a dancer. No tattoos, just my own beautiful skin. And I'd be naked every chance I got. I'd leave my window shades up, let the whole world look. Good for you. Amanda laughed a little sadly, like she was unworthy of her own fantasy. Eve wanted to tell her she was beautiful already, but instead she made a toast to Ursula and Juniper. Juniper and Ursula, Amanda replied, and they clinked their tiny glasses. By the time they left the restaurant, Eve had come full circle, back to the idea that this was a date, and a pretty good one at that. They'd talked for hours without hitting any dead spots. They'd drunk a little too much wine. They'd laughed and told the truth about their lives. It was quiet as she walked Amanda to her car, a bracing autumnal chill in the air. The fluttery feeling in Eve's chest was even stronger than it had been before. "Thanks for dinner," Amanda said. "I really enjoyed it." "Me too." Instead of getting in her car, Amanda just stood there, smiling shyly, like she was waiting for something else to happen. Eve wanted to kiss her, but she was paralyzed, unsure about which one of them was the confident one. It has to be me, she thought. She was older, she was the boss, but she didn't feel confident at all. She felt lost and scared, like she was floating in space. And then, almost as if she were reading Eve's mind, Amanda stepped forward, opening her arms and tilting her chin at an inviting angle. Eve swooped in and kissed her on the mouth. "Whoa!" Amanda stiffened and pulled away with a shocked expression, raising both hands in self-defense. "What are you doing?" "I'm sorry." Eve was mortified. "I just thought..." "Wow." Amanda laughed nervously, wiping her wrist across her mouth. The gesture seemed a little excessive. The kiss had only lasted a second. No tongue or saliva involved. "I just wanted to give you a hug." "Oh, God." Eve hid her face in her hands. "I'm so stupid. I drank too much. I'm so sorry." "It's okay," Amanda told her, still sounding a little shocked. "It's no big deal." "Yes, it is," Eve muttered into her palm. "I shouldn't have done that. It wasn't right." "Really, it's okay." Eve uncovered her face. "Are you sure?" "Don't worry." Amanda touched her gently on the arm. "I won't tell anyone. I promise." Eve felt a little sick. She hadn't thought about the possibility of Amanda telling anyone. "Thank you," she said. "I would really appreciate that." She drove home in a fog of regret, wondering how she could have done something so irresponsible, so unlike herself. Was she that lonely, that desperate for sexual contact? It made no sense taking a risk like that, jeopardizing her job, her home, her son's college education, just to pretend for a night that she was living in a porn video. "You are so stupid," she told herself, trying not to think about the bitter disappointment she'd felt when Amanda's lips had failed to open. She was normally a careful person, careful to a fault. And now she'd gone and put her livelihood in the hands of a young woman she barely knew, a girl with a grenade tattooed on her chest, probably not the best decision maker in the world. It was a terrible thing to hand someone that kind of power, even someone who claimed to be your friend. She wanted to call Amanda and repeat her apology, let her know that it would never happen again, that their relationship would be cordial and professional for however long Amanda remained at the senior center. But maybe a call wasn't the best idea. Not so soon. Maybe that would only aggravate the situation, make it seem like a bigger deal than it already was. But she had to say something for her own peace of mind, so she sent the blandest text she could think of. "You okay?" "Yeah," Amanda replied, almost immediately. "Fine." "Are we still friends?" "Totally," Amanda replied, with a smiley face added for reassurance. A moment later, another text arrived, a single word trapped in a separate bubble. Ursula. Just the name, no exclamation mark. It looked sad like that, all alone, dead on arrival. Okay, that's the end of that. No, thank you. Anybody want to start? And I think do we have a mic for questions? So that's back there. So if you could speak into the mic, and I can repeat in case people don't hear. Any questions? Yes, we have one down here and one over there. We'll just wait a second wait for the mic. It's coming. Oh. If it doesn't work, I can repeat. Oh, okay. Well, you can ask me and I can repeat. Yeah, okay, go ahead. Oh, wow. So we went deep on the first question. Um, so, so there were, let me try and break it into parts. The first was unspoken, we were in a church. The second is, do write a lot about religion, or have recently. My book, The Abstinence Teacher, was about the clash between a liberal sex education teacher and this sort of activist evangelical church that it actually succeeds in getting her fired. And it was kind of a culture war novel. And then The Leftovers is really about religion as a response to the mystery of our lives, though it was set in a kind of dystopian world. But this was specifically about the relationship between religion and sexuality, and maybe the damage that religion does. That was in the question. How conscious am I of the relationship between religion and desire? And in this case, what the questioner said was a damaging relationship. And I will say, one of the reasons I've been writing so much about sex, Little Children's a book about sex and sexual transgression, Abstinence Teacher's a book about sex education, Mrs. Fletcher's a book about porn, and I feel like I've been just trying to understand just the speed and the sort of the ongoing power of the sexual revolution that has basically spanned my lifetime. I think, I definitely have been thinking about what it means for all of us to live in a world in which porn is so prevalent, and I think it has altered our sexual behavior in all sorts of ways. And I do think that I grew up in a Catholic working class world, and so if you grew up in a world like that, sex was very much the unspoken thing. The joke that I often tell about my family is that we were closeted heterosexuals. You could have a sexual identity, but you really were not supposed to talk about it. And that was also, a world where there was basically one sexual identity available. You were straight. We didn't think of it as straight. It was just like you were a person. And if you were gay, then that was some tragic aberration. That was the world I grew up in. I used to say, there was nobody gay. When I got to college, I'd say, there was nobody gay in my high school. 20 years later, I'd go to my reunion and go, there were a lot of gay people in my high school. And Mrs. Fletcher is about, we have somehow in the space of just a few decades moved into a world where there are a lot more sexual identities available to people, but only to some people. Mrs. Fletcher is a 46-year-old woman. She is feeling like she doesn't have one, and then this word MILF is sort of, sent to her, and she just decides, all right, if there's a word that makes me visible, that puts me back into the arena of people who remain desirable and visible, then let me try that on. But so that's one thing. So that almost says like, oh, there's a kind of there's something invigorating about this porn for Mrs. Fletcher. On the other hand, her son is this sort of college, he's this sort of bro who, she overhears him with his girlfriend before he's leaving for college, and he's talking to her in this kind of, what seems to her like this very misogynistic way, you know, using a kind of script that sounds like it came from bad porn, and she's, the book really is just trying to look at sex in all of, in a number of different ways that it's occurring right now, filtered through the internet, social media, and this ongoing sexual revolution. And you know, I don't claim to have any, I don't have any particular opinion about, I just feel like this thing is happening, and it's happening right in front of us, and it's really confusing, and I feel like it's difficult for me as a parent to talk to my kids. I think their sexual world is entirely different from what my sexual world was. My sexual world was entirely different from the world that my parents grew up in. You know, I often talk about this book, On Chesil Beach, by Ian McEwan. Do you guys know this? It was a book set in I think the 50s, right? And it's about the wedding night of two people who have absolutely no sexual experience and no information about sex. And it's like a 50-page, you know, tour de force description of what this wedding night is like for these people who know nothing. It's very traumatic, and it's you know, it would be funny if it weren't so damaging to both of them. And you realize like we've gone from this point where it was possible to get married with no information whatsoever and have sex with no information, to a world where, you know, 13-year-olds have seen or have the ability to see things that, you know, I hadn't heard of when, you know, or saw as like some bizarre fetish, you know, that for them it just sort of is just another thing that people do. You know, if you look at porn, it just divides the world into endless categories, endless, very specific categories, and you know, it's just, these are entirely different worlds that our kids are living in than we were, and there were bad things about the world I lived in. I didn't understand that there were gay people around me, or I didn't, and if I did, I would have thought that there was something wrong with them, because that was how I was raised. There's obviously huge improvements in a lot of places, and then, but there are also like kind of things that are a little you know, alienating and strange about the world we're in now. There's a great book called Girls and Sex by Peggy Orenstein, where she just went out and spoke to a lot of women in their teens and 20s and just asked them to talk about sex. And one of the things that they said was that they were very aware that a lot of the boys they were with had come with a porn script in their head, that they would be like staging the sex, you know, that you're supposed to do this. And it wasn't this thing of, you know, two people, you know, meeting and exploring and figuring things out together. It was really like, you be a prop in my fantasy. So again, I'm just trying to explore this world in this book and not say porn is bad, porn is good. It's just porn is here, and it's available for people to use in these ways. Yes?
So, following on that, how did you approach writing how a woman might feel about sexuality, gender identity, porn, as a man?
So yeah, so this is how do I, as a man, figure out how to approach writing about women, and of course this is a political act right now to do it, and it's one that, you know, can be, if if you were an academic, you might say it's problematic. And as a fiction writer, I understand it as a person, but as a fiction writer, I feel like that's what we do. We have to imagine lives different from our own, and I hope it's possible. I mean, I have to leave it to the reader to say, did I do it in a way that felt convincing, not not horrifying, or simplistic, or sexist, or I started out as a fiction writer. I was very much considered like a guy's writer. Because Bad Haircut was about boys. Each story was about a male friendship, and I wrote a book about a rock band that was all male, and I used to be put on tables like next to Nick Hornby under like lad lit. And I had been in graduate school during the sort of the first wave of identity politics, and people just started to say for the first time, like, hey, do you have the right as a white man to write a black character, for instance? Do you have the right to write a gay character? Do you have the right to write from a woman's perspective? And of course, we're operating in a novelistic tradition where like my favorite book was Anna Karenina, and and Madame Bovary is a book that I go back to all the time. The Scarlet Letter, I think, is an amazing. Obviously it has been done, but I was definitely nervous about it. It was election, I think, where I realized that to tell the story the way I wanted to, with a multitude of points of view, that I had two female characters that I had to write in first person, because the book is a series of short first person chapters that gives you kind of a kaleidoscopic look at this election. And Tammy, the character Tammy, is a 16-year-old lesbian, and I thought, how am I going to do this? And what I did is kind of a defensive act, but also I think a useful one. I just made her as much like me as possible. Like she is the closest character in that book to who I was in high school. And I think it did something, now that I've started to know more actors, I did something that the actor, you just find some way in to that character, and then there's this act of empathetic imagination, I think, that either works or it doesn't. But once I did that and I felt like it worked, I started to be much more interested in entering the minds of my women characters. I sort of feel like, especially women my age, I think, have lived through this very complicated passage. They were probably the first generation that grew up in a world that they could foresee as feminist, in a sense. Like that second wave had happened, and I remember being in college and hearing people saying, like, when I get married, it's going to be a partnership, and my husband's going to do half the housework and half the child care, and people said this without any. It was innocently, like we can do this, right? We all agree that this is how it should be, so let's do it. And of course, then we started to get married and have kids and discover that that particular vision was somewhat utopian, and it's just been I think a confusing and interesting time, and it seemed really, I don't know, it felt richer to me in a way than the world of men my age. I'm not sure why, but it's just as a writer I was drawn to it and have been writing about it for a few books. Yes? Okay. Oh, there we go.
So the arc arc of your the arc of your writing. Um, for example, when do you know the ending? At what point is your writing very much a discovery process as you go? How much of an idea do you have when you're beginning? That kind of thing.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question about writing a novel, which is how much do you know and when do you make these decisions? And I wrote a novel when I was about 30. I was out of grad school, and it was a long novel. It was about a family that won the lottery, and it was rejected by about 40 publishers, because there used to be a lot of publishers. Now there are like 4 conglomerates, but back then there were imprint after imprint. So I have this envelope, this book of shame kind of, and basically almost all the editors said the same thing. They said, the first half of this book was so good, and then it just sort of drifted off into, just all these kind of separate stories, and the book lost its momentum and its center, and I thought, oh, all right, I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to write a book that just kind of drifts away. And so what I started to do for a few novels was I'm going to give myself a really tight time frame. So like Election was the first book where I experimented with this. Okay, this is going to be about this election, and each chapter is going to, in some sense, focus on the obvious steps that happen in an election. So chapter 1, the candidates put out their petitions, and in another chapter, they give their speeches, they put up their posters, and I said to myself, so the book will have a very clear question: who's going to win this election? And what I realized was that it was really good for me if I didn't know. And so I really did try to wall off that decision from the writing of the book. And every time I would write a chapter that might put this character in the lead, I'd follow it with a chapter that would show how that other character had counteracted it, and maybe, oh, that person's in the lead now. And I tried to postpone that decision for as long as I could. And that has become a kind of a method for me of, I want my book to have a kind of central question. So in Little Children, these lovers meet in, the second chapter, and they start this affair, and really the whole book is just, are they going to run off together? Is this more than an affair? Are these people going to leave their spouses and get together? And again, it's like I tried, that was clearly the question for the reader and for me, and I tried to, not know for as long as possible. So it's kind of a mix. It's not just this sort of, I'm going to start writing and let the story kind of dictate itself. I know what the question of the book is. I just don't know what the answer is. So Mrs. Fletcher doesn't quite have, it has different questions in different parts. So it's, and I don't want to spoil it exactly, but there's a huge part of the book which involves a will she or won't she in terms of a particular sexual relationship that has been proposed to her. And then there's a different question for the son who's at college, which is he going to make it there, basically? But this book doesn't have quite the same unitary focus, I think. Yes.
My question, can you hear me? My question is, you use the title is Mrs. Fletcher. So my question is, what made you decide Mrs. Fletcher over E. Fletcher or Eve Fletcher? And is that deliberate in a sense because it creates this formality and this whole thing that she's the executive director? I'm just curious.
Actually, so the question wasn't so much Mrs. Fletcher versus Eve Fletcher. I handed this book to my publisher. The title was The MILF. And, you know, I kind of knew that it was a provocative title and it would sound like kind of cheap or, you know, porny a little bit. But the book really is an investigation of identity, and I thought this is about Eve adopting this identity. And my publisher, who's wonderful, but very stubborn, just said, you cannot do that. And their idea was there are just people in large swaths of the country who would not want to be seen with a book with that title, so why would you, even though there's a book called Assholes that people walk around with, it was a big bestseller. But anyway, it was really a game of chicken, you know. It was like I said, well, I like my title, and unless you have a better one, I'm going to stick with mine. And it went on for a long time, this game of chicken. They kept proposing terrible titles to me, or what I thought were terrible titles. And then finally, it was like the night before the book had to go in the catalog. And she said, I've never had a problem like this with an author before where, you know, we've told you that it can't be the MILF. And you won't agree to anything else. And it's like either we agree to something right now or we postpone the book, you know? And I'm like, all right. So I lost the game of chicken. And the very first list that my editor had sent me as possible titles, Mrs. Fletcher was on it. And I even said to her at that time, I said, you know, I like that. In the first chapter, the son's girlfriend comes by, and she keeps calling Eve Mrs. Fletcher. And Eve doesn't like this because she's not married anymore. This was her married name, and she's not a Mrs., and she doesn't really see herself as Fletcher, though she's kept the name. So it's like, please don't call me that, is what she says when she's called Mrs. Fletcher. And I kind of realized that it is a flip side of this identity coin. It's like, when the book starts, she's Mrs. Fletcher, and she doesn't want to be that. And the question is, well, who does she become? And in a sense, she becomes the MILF for a little while, just to see what that's like. So I thought it's the other side of the identity coin. The other virtue of Mrs. Fletcher, I thought, was that it had a Mrs. Robinson echo to it, and there's a reason why that works for the book. But yeah, everything about Mrs. Fletcher she objects to, and yet she's called that. And so it's really about somebody who has an identity that she wants to discard, and to do that she needs to assume another one. Well, one more, yes.
Thank
Wow,
you.
sorry.
Oh. So now that so many of your stories have been adapted, does it affect your writing process to know that your books might not just be read but actually watched? And what is your relationship like with filmmakers?
Yeah, okay, that's a... I get asked this a lot, and I hope that I'm being honest when I say, when I'm writing a book, I'm not thinking about its second life as a film or a TV show, though I know on some level that will exist. But part of it is just writing fiction is hard, and I feel like I'm usually just wrestling with the sentence in front of me, the paragraph in front of me. Because of the way I write, I don't know exactly where the book's going, so I can't even think strategically beyond what is happening in this scene. Rather, it just seems like a level beyond it to think I need to steer this scene in a way that will seem better on screen. The other thing is, once you know that you are going to maybe have a second chance at it, you can relax and say, like, if I adapt it, I can make a different choice and just see what happens there. And the other thing is, being a screenwriter, which I've been doing quite a bit, I'm aware that there are certain things I can't do in that format. I can't move in time. I can't get deep into my characters' heads. And so I feel like when I'm writing fiction, I should avail myself of those tools. So I think, oddly, being a screenwriter has helped me actually appreciate what's at the disposal of the fiction writer. That said, I think I've started to have a pretty unusual career in the sense that, you know, Little Children, I co-wrote the script with Todd Field, and you know, that was a wonderful movie. And then The Leftovers, I actually became a producer and a writer in the writer's room for like, it was like 5 years of my life that I spent working on the TV show. And then Mrs. Fletcher now I'm adapting, and it's going to be, we're going to film the pilot in June for HBO. It's going to be a half-hour show, and the wonderful Catherine Hahn is playing Mrs. Fletcher, which is very exciting. So, yeah. No, you know what? There's that show Smilf. So she's taking it. So we're sticking with Mrs. Fletcher. All right. Well, I think that's it. I thank you so much for coming, and I enjoyed talking.